if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, in London. So we've got one back from England and Sweden as well. All right. So I can see more and more people trickling in.
Hmm.
Tina, also in London. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Um, I think we can get it started then.
Cool.
Yeah, Arash, is there anything you wanted to say before I take it away?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks everybody for joining the Learning Network webinar. We're sort of delighted that you're here. For those that may be new to us, the Learning Network is a community run by volunteers supporting learning professionals across the industry with resources, mentoring, events, and a space to grow no matter your role or experience. So we're using Zoom today, as you've already established. The chat is working. We also have a Q&A box, so if you do have any questions throughout, there will be time at the end for us to, oh, I say for us, for Jamie to answer the questions. So if you just want to pop a question in the Q&A box as it comes to you, then we can tackle those at the end. Today's session's also been recorded, so it'll be available to members via the dashboard after the event. So I'll let us get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jamie Dixon from the Story Habit, and he's going to be running a fantastic session for you today on a 5-step framework to impactful facilitation and training delivery. So over to you, Jamie.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. And so in today's webinar, I'm going to run you through a framework that I call the 5 elements that can help you design impactful training and facilitate much more impactfully as well. And to make this webinar a bit practical, we'll be working on a simple example. I'll be asking you some questions and you can share your thoughts in the chat, but I'll be building through this example throughout the webinar. And by the end of it, we'll see how we can use the 5 elements framework to plan a 60-minute workshop. And you can use this framework for planning face-to-face workshops or virtual workshops. It works with both formats. But before we get into that, just a quick introduction to myself. So I'm Jamie Dixon. I'm a storytelling coach. I do storytelling coaching, and I also run a lot of storytelling workshops as well. And I'm based in Brighton. I'm originally from Brighton, but previously I lived in Shanghai in China for 16 years. And that's really where I cut my teeth. I started as a trainer, facilitator in 2011. And at the time, I'm fluent in Mandarin, and my work involved representing a lot of international training companies and running leadership development programs for their international clients in China in Mandarin. And I've been back in the UK now for the last 2.5 years. In total, I've worked with about 170 different multinational companies throughout the Asia Pacific region and Europe as well, in all sorts of different industries. And I'm also the author of this book, The Story Habit, that most of my workshops are based upon. And The Story Habit is one of my books. And before I wrote this book, I wrote another book, which is what this workshop, this webinar will be based on. And I'll get to the story of that book right now. I remember in the earliest days of my career as a facilitator, one of my mentors gave me a piece of advice which has really stuck with me ever since. And that advice was that the greatest compliment a customer can give a facilitator is that they don't pay. And what that means to me is that when you facilitate, it should be so smooth and so effortless and so easy that it's almost like you didn't do anything, because most of the doing was from the participants. And when it works that way, it really does look like you're not doing much at all. And that way, it is very effective. The reality, though, is most of your work is done upfront in the preparation and planning. If you do the preparation and planning really, really well, then the facilitation just runs so smoothly. And this is a lesson that I really took to heart. And I found it very helpful when I was facilitating in China, because I found it a very challenging environment to facilitate in China. My role was to take these training materials that had been designed in Europe and the US and run them in China with Chinese participants in Chinese. And there was a reason this was challenging, because in a lot of Western cultures, we are very conceptual. We love thinking, we love debating, we love discussing, we love ideas. But China is a culture of doing, and it doesn't like thinking, debating concepts or ideas. And as an example of this, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner of this picture, this is a picture of the Shanghai skyline. And you can see one of the skyscrapers in the bottom left-hand corner, the one with a spike on top. That is called the Jinmao Dasha, the Jinmao Tower. And in 2006, I went up to the top of that tower. And at the time, that tower was the fourth tallest building in the world. And there was no other tower taller than that in China at the time. And then 6 months later, I went back and they'd completed the building right next to it that looks like a bottle opener. And so 6 months later, there was a building even taller than the fourth tallest building in the world. And that, to me, really represented the pace at which people got things done. It's not a culture that has time for thinking. It's a culture that does things. And that was the people I was facing in the room. And I had to take these very conceptual, heavily theoretical, discussion-based training materials and run them in a way that resonated with Chinese people who are do, and don't have time for all that nonsense. And so that set me off on a journey to research how on earth I can do this. And it took me 6 years of researching and looking into all sorts of different areas. And one area that I discovered during that time was behavior science, which really had a big influence on my thinking behind training design. And eventually this led to my book, Shaping Paths: How to Design and Deliver Practical Training. And so, long story short, the framework that my book is based upon, I call it the 5 elements. And you can see these 5 elements here. And let me just run through these very, very quickly. And then I'm going to pause and throw a question at you. And so the first element is priming. This is getting people ready to learn. It's warming them up, getting them interested, getting them comfortable, opening them up, and just getting them into the right kind of mindset to learn. And then guiding. Now, this is the content part of your training. And this is where we give them the information they need to get ready to start practicing. And with practicing, this is where we get them, we help them master new behaviors. And after practicing comes reflecting, where they reflect on what just happened and they adjust their mindset so they can approach it differently next time. And then finally, a bit of time to commit. So once we finish the workshop, what are they going to commit to applying back at work? So that was a rough overview, and I'm going to go through in more detail throughout today's webinar. But I have some questions for you first, and I'd like to see your thoughts in the chat. And the first question is, at which part does the real learning happen? You get to see your thoughts in the chat here. Which part do you think the real learning happens in? Please share your thoughts in the chat. So Egil, reflecting, Liz in the application. So great answers. My answer is in the reflecting part. I can see Sarah says all of them. The reality is there's always going to be a bit of learning in all of these phases, and in the application especially. But in my opinion, the reflecting part is the most important part, because reflection is the physical act of learning. When you are reflecting, you are actually burning new neural pathways in the brain. And you can think of it this way. If any of you do coaching, and in coaching, you're asking people questions, and you're asking people questions to get them to think. And when you ask them a question, if they answer it immediately, that's a neural pathway that already existed. But if you ask a question, they have to go, that act there is the burning of new neural pathways. And that is where the real learning happens. And so we really want to allocate a good chunk of time to the reflection. But the reflection is also based upon the practicing. So we also want to make sure that there's a decent practice for them to reflect upon. So these are the really important parts of the workshop, and everything else we can base around those. So that brings us to another question. When planning, which part should you start with? When you start planning, which part should you start with? See your thoughts in the chat. Seedpet thinks committing. So what they need to apply. So the end goal you want to achieve. So yes, Hannelore, I'm going to go with that. And Liz, for workplace training, I'd say start by working out what people need to do differently and work backwards from there. Yes, we want to start by thinking about what they need to do differently. And that is what forms the basis of our practice. What should they be doing differently? That decides the practice activity that we're going to have. And so in this framework, I'm going to say plan around this. Now, to get to the practice, we also need to do a bit of analysis, first of all, to identify, just as Liz says, what they need to do differently when they're back at the workplace, and work backwards from there. So before we even start planning our training, we want to do a bit of analysis to identify what is the objective we want them to be able to achieve, that our practice will be designed around. So just like Liz says, start with the end in mind. And my animations came up a bit too early here. But I think of this as like a funnel. And we have a bunch of questions that we want to ask. And as we go through these questions, we gradually filter out information until we land on an objective that our practice activity can be based around. So the first question is, what do the stakeholders need the participants to do differently at work? Stakeholders are paying the budget. If they're not happy, they don't pay. So we have to please them, whether we like that or not. But then, of the things the stakeholders want the participants to do differently, what do the participants care about the most? So the participants, if they don't care, they won't learn. Learning is an emotional experience. If they're not emotionally invested, they won't learn. So of those, what do the participants care about the most? And then, this is my favorite question. What are the 20% of contexts where they can make 80% of the desired impact? So this is the Pareto principle in action here. And as an example, I remember I was once in Ubisoft's offices in Shanghai, and I was speaking to the L&D manager there, and we were talking about running an intercultural communication skills training for their local staff. And they were talking about all of the challenges that their staff face. And my camera's gone out of focus. There we go. All the challenges that their staff face when they're working with people in Montreal and all these other places. And they have lots of different challenges. And in the end, I asked them, what context would make the biggest difference here? Like, you've got all of these different things, meetings, presentations, emails, phone calls. Which of those situations can they have the biggest impact in? And he paused for a moment. He said, honestly, it's emails. If we can help them improve their communication via emails, that prevents a lot of miscommunication. It saves a lot of time. And so we just focused in on emails. So I really like this question because it really helps you filter in and focus in on what really matters. And then in those contexts, again, same question, what 20% of behaviors will make 80% of the difference? So really focusing in and filtering out as much fluff as you possibly can until you land on what is absolutely essential. And then now we have the behavior. To what degree of success should they be able to do that behavior? And so by the end of the training, participants will be able to do X behavior in Y context to Z degree. So you can think B, C, D, behavior, context, degree. And so as an example, so the example we'll work on today, we speak to these stakeholders and they say that they want their people managers to start giving effective performance feedback because they're just not doing that and they're not good at that. And okay, we know they need to be giving feedback. So let's speak to the participants in that area. What do they care about? Well, they care about addressing difficult behaviors. They have team members who turn up to meetings late. They have team members who are always complaining about things. It's having a negative impact. And they want to address these behaviors because there's a real headache for them. And what are the 20% of contexts where they can make 80% of the desired impact? One-to-one meetings. You know, it's rare that we would give feedback outside of a one-to-one meeting, especially for something so sensitive as this. So let's focus on the context of one-to-one meetings. And then the behavior, well, here's a tried and tested way. It's very simple. It's very easy. SBI, feedback around situation, behavior, impact. Let's use that. It's very easy. It solves this problem. And to what degree of success should they be able to do that? They should make sure that when they're giving the feedback, it covers all three parts of SBI. And so just like that, we have our practice activity. We now know, because the practice activity should match the context as closely as possible. And we know the context is one-to-one meetings. So how do we match that as closely as possible? A role play. I can't think of a better way. Give feedback addressing a difficult behavior. That's something the participants are interested in using the SBI structure. So there we have our objective. And that forms the basis of our practice activity. And so just like that, we've pretty much designed our practice activity. And now we know what our practice activity looks like. We want to think about how much time it's going to take and what exactly is it going to look like. So some questions to keep in mind are here. So for example, how will you test their ability to achieve the objective? Well, maybe there needs to be a checklist in this role play. And at the end, their partner goes through the checklist and did you do this? Did you do that? Did you do this? To make sure they did it or not. I won't go through all of the questions, but for example, what, if any, content is needed for the practice? Well, they're probably going to need a little case study to base the role play upon. And so how long is that going to take? I've seen a really ridiculous practice activity where it was an hour long, an hour for a role play. And it took 40 minutes for the participants to get their heads around the case study before they could even do the role play. It was pages and pages and pages of information. And English, it was in English, and that wasn't their native language. And so of 1 hour for a role play, it took 40 minutes just to read the bloody case study. It's ridiculous. So we don't want to give them too much content for the case study here. That should be as simple as possible. And what do the participants need to prepare? Well, they need time to read through the case study. What do you need to prepare? If this is a face-to-face workshop, you need to distribute the case study That might take you a few minutes. Or you need to send it to them on Zoom in the chat, for example, or put it as a screenshot, and so on. So I'm going to pause there. How many minutes do you think we should allow for this practice activity here? I'd like to see your thoughts in the chat. How many minutes do you think we should allow? If this is going to be a role play in pairs, how long should we allow in a 60-minute workshop? Let's see your thoughts in the chat. How many minutes? Okay. So I'm going to go with Elise's answer of 20 minutes. Yeah, so Liz, excellent. 20 minutes, 5 for them to read and get their heads around it, and maybe 10 to do it, and 5 to reflect. We can leave a bit more time for the reflection. I was thinking about 5 minutes to get their heads around the case study, and then let's say 7 minutes practice each, with 5 minutes to practice, and then maybe 2 or 3 minutes feedback to each other, swap roles, exactly the same thing. So that's easily 20 minutes. And ideally, it might actually just take 15 minutes, and then we have a bit of buffer time. And this is why we want to start our preparation with the practice part, because we can already see that this has formed the bulk of our workshop. It's the most important, well, it's the second most important part, but it builds the foundation for the most important part, which is the next part. So reflection. So let's move to the reflection part. And for reflection, let's imagine this. We're in the workshop. CPET, should we ask them to prepare beforehand to save time during the face-to-face? So in theory, that's a great idea. In practice, it really depends on the culture in your company. I have had so many instances where we've said, yeah, just like Liz, some prepare, some don't. I've had some instances where no one does any of the preparation, and some instances where they're really good and they all do the preparation. But I've just come to the conclusion, in my experience, it is safest to assume no one will do the pre-work. That's always my default assumption. So maybe the company you work for, maybe it's a great culture and they're reliable people and they will do that, in which case, great. But I don't come up against so many reliable cultures, unfortunately. So let's come back to the workshop. We're in the room. We've just finished the practice activity. We've gone and stop. Now we want to move them to reflection. So let me introduce here a framework that I have to be careful pronouncing. I call this framework VACA, V-A-C-A. And it stands for vent, analyze, conclude, and apply. And so vent is, go back to that moment where you've stopped the practice activity. What is going to happen in reality is you stop, and then suddenly there's a lot of chatter because they're getting all of this stuff off their chest. As they were in that practice activity, a lot of thoughts and feelings bubbled up for them, and they need some time to process that and just get it off of their chest. So allow time for that. And a lot of the time in workshops, I literally just leave it. And I find it just fizzles away after a few minutes naturally. So allow some time for the venting, and then analyze, conclude, apply. So we want to be asking questions here about, so for example, analyze what happened in that activity. What did they say? And how did you feel about that? Or how did you feel during the activity? And why did you feel that way? And then conclude, which is about what did you learn from that? So what did you learn from that experience just now? What do you think is after doing that? What do you think is really important about giving feedback? And then apply. What would you do differently when you go back to work? How could you use this framework at work? Or how do you feel about using this framework at work? Now, these are just the questions that you want to base the reflection activity around. But we also want to bring the activity to life. And I'm a big fan of someone called Roger Greenaway. And he's an expert on debriefing, basically. And he coined the term active reviewing. And I strongly recommend looking into him. I'll put his name here. Roger Greenaway, active reviewing. And he says that the debrief, the review, the reflection activity should be more engaging than the activity we just had, which I think is a brilliant idea. Because if it's more engaging than the activity we just had, we're going to have a much richer level of insight that comes out. So some principles that can help make it engaging, I'm just going to list here. I won't go through all of these, but just quickly, the first one, use more body parts. It's such a simple principle, but I've noticed that when people do more with their body, they're more engaged. So an example, I was once running a little research workshop with a group of 90 participants, and they were sitting 10 to a table, and it was round tables. And one of the activities was I needed to see if they agreed or disagreed with statements on the slide. And it was incredibly dull activity. And I just said, if you agree, put your hand up. If you disagree, put your hand up. And there's not much engagement. So then I said, okay, all right, everyone stand up. If you agree with this statement, go stand to that side of the room. If you disagree, go stand on that side. And all of a sudden, I couldn't shut them up because they were much more physically involved. So a simple example is you have a discussion, don't get them sitting down discussing. That's what flip charts are for. Get them standing up around a flip chart. On a virtual workshop, it's a little bit more challenging, but I've seen some creative ways getting people to draw pictures, stand at a distance, show it, or whatever, point to things in their room, anything to get them to use more body parts. Another example, draw on popular culture. There's all sorts of game shows that you can copy and just copy the format of a game show to ask the questions. And my favorite activity, so make it a task. My favorite activity directly from Roger Greenaway is called simultaneous surveys. And I actually use this at the beginning of my workshops in a classroom. And the idea is you split people into groups. So maybe you have 4 groups and you give each group a question. So one group's question would be, what do you want to learn today? Another group's question would be, what are your biggest challenges with, and so on. And then you say, I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I'd like you as an individual to remember your group's question and take a pen and a piece of paper and walk around the room and ask 5 different people from other groups your question and write down their answers. And after 10 minutes, you're going to go back to your groups and you're going to share all of the answers that you collected. And so in those 10 minutes, it's a simultaneous survey. They're all asking each other their questions and they're all collecting answers. And it's a great way to just start the day on a high and get people mingling and really raise the energy levels. So I'm going to ask a question here to you just to see what, if any, ideas you have at the moment. What ideas do you have for an engaging post-practice reflection activity? So we've just had that role play where they practice giving each other feedback. Now we want to get them to reflect on that. What kind of ideas do you have? Even if it's not a well-developed idea yet, what kind of ideas are coming to mind for you? Start, stop, continue. Yeah, that's a great framework to build the reflection discussion around. And when I see that, I see labels on the floor: start, stop, continue, get them in pairs, get them moving to different points. If you're going to talk about what you're going to stop doing, go to the stop place. Or if you're going to talk about what you'll start doing, go to the start place. I'm sure you can come up with other ideas as well. But yeah, that's a great structure to base the questions around. Anyone else have any other ideas on what kind of activities you could do, how to make this a more engaging discussion? And Sarah, yeah, perfect. Stand on a continuum to show how confident and comfortable they feel. And as an example, one thing you can buy on Amazon is a pack of camping ropes. And this pack here, I'm sure you can find it on Amazon. It has 6 different ropes, and they're quite long. And so for any continuum activity or horseshoe activity, you just lay the rope down on the floor. It just adds a bit of spice to the activity. Liz, bingo, you put your top reflection on a piece of paper and walk around the room to find someone else with the same idea-ish. Yeah, beautiful. And everyone's walking around talking to everyone. Yeah, perfect. So just some simple ideas there. Anything just to raise the energy and make it more interesting. And I just want to go back to Liz's comment earlier. You said you really like that vent stage to start with, because it is exactly what happens in reality. It is, yeah. You really do notice it. Stop an activity, they won't shut up. And so just let them vent. It is exactly what happens in reality. And yes, you do have to be a bit more creative. It's harder to come up with ideas for reflection. There are still ways of making it fun. I have a great friend called Jimbo Clark, and he does something called thinking in and out of the box. And his whole thing is he has a physical box that he puts on people's heads. And the whole workshop is, the first half of the workshop, you're drawing your identity on the outside of your box. And you put the box on, you're like, hi, this is me. And then the second half is you open the box, and on the inside are your filters and the pressures and the goals that you have. And it gives you a chance to reflect on what those are. And so in a face-to-face workshop, that's what he does. It's really fun. And during COVID, I noticed that he, obviously he couldn't do that, but instead he just took what everyone has in their room, paper, and he took people through how to make the box, and then he put them into groups, and they could show each other their boxes. It was the same thing. So with a bit of creativity, there are ways of doing it. But yeah, it is more challenging. That's a reality, but it's still possible. So we're more than halfway through the webinar now, and we're now more than halfway through planning our workshop. And we've only done these 2 elements. But thankfully, these 2 elements represent the bulk of our workshop. And thankfully, because we started planning these 2 parts, we've allowed enough time for these 2 parts. A big mistake I see with people who start designing training is they don't allow enough time for the important parts. They start with what seems to make sense, the introduction, the icebreaker, and then before you know it, you've run out of time for even the reflection. And also, practice, we might leave time for practice, but then we don't have enough time for reflection. So before you design any of the other elements, start with these 2. So the next part is committing. Equally important, although I wouldn't allow as much time for it, because they probably already have a lot of ideas for this now. Now, for the committing part, let me introduce to you something that looks a little intimidating. But this, I guarantee, has had a massive impact on your life. You might not realize it. This is from someone called B.J. Fogg. He is a behavior scientist at Stanford University. And this is called the Fogg behavior model. Now, he was teaching this behavior model in, I think it was a class on persuasive technology at Stanford University. Long story short, a lot of the students who went through that class, one became the founder of Instagram. I think another created the like function for Facebook. Another created something called infinite scroll. So, you know, when you're browsing down LinkedIn and it never stops, that's because that came out of this this methodology. And so it sounds like BJ Fogg is really evil considering the impact that technology has had on us. But since then, he has recognized what people are doing with this. And he's changed his focus to habits and how we can empower ourselves. And so he has a book called Tiny Habits, which I really recommend reading. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but I'll try to give long story short. B equals map. A behavior will only happen if there is a motivation, enough motivation, enough ability, and a prompt coming together at the same time. So your behavior of looking at your smartphone will only happen when ding, there's a prompt, and A, ability, it's super easy. You do it without even thinking. And M, motivation. Ooh, who posted another cat photo? You're curious. What am I missing out on? When those three things come together, you get behavior. But you can see we have ability at the bottom. We have things that are hard to do and things that are easy to do. And you can also see motivation, low, high. Now, without going into too much detail, the key lessons you can take from this are: one, do not depend on motivation. It is unreliable. You might wake up this morning really motivated by the idea of running a marathon, and you're going to start a rigorous training routine to achieve that in 6 months from now. But then tomorrow you break your leg, and then suddenly your motivation has disappeared. Motivation is in large part out of our control. It is heavily influenced by context, environment, time, mental, physical state. So forget about motivation. And if you look at the chart, you can see the green line. This shows what things are possible. And so when something is hard to do, you can do hard things when you have high motivation. But when you don't have high motivation, you can't do hard things. And the things that you can do become easier and easier and easier. So the long story short is behaviors that are easy to do are more reliable because they don't require much motivation. That's why we mindlessly scroll on our mobile phones all day. Behaviors here are unreliable. They require way too much motivation. So we want the behavior part to be really simple. So what does that mean for you? We need to be asking our participants questions like these. So forget about the motivation part, but the prompt part: when should you be doing this behavior? And how will you remember to do this behavior at the time? And the ability part: what will make this easier for you to do at the time? So basically, we want to be asking them two types of questions. One, about how will they make sure they remember to do that at the time. I give an example. If you've ever trained people on public speaking, presentation skills, one of the things that a lot of people need to work on is speaking slower. Now, we can all do that. It's really easy to speak slowly. But what happens is in the moment of a presentation, people forget. They get nervous and they forget. And so they need something to remind them in that moment. Sometimes I get people to write slow in big letters on their hands, and it reminds them in that moment. So reminder is one thing. And another thing is, how would you make it easier? What would make it easier to do? And yeah, Liz, Post-it notes. That's one of the greatest inventions for behavior change. Who'd have thought it? So question for you guys and girls: what other variations of these questions could you ask them to help with their plan, with their action planning? What thoughts do you have here? what other variations of these questions? Yeah, Sarah, what gets in the way of them doing it? Yeah, brilliant question. What other ideas? Any other ideas? And yeah, how could they overcome that? Yeah. So basically, any variation of a question that asks them, how will you remember? And how could you make this easier? So I'm going to allow 10 minutes for that. Maybe we don't need, yeah, CPET, what support could they ask for? Yeah, brilliant. So I'm going to allow 10 minutes for the committing part. Probably they don't need 10 minutes. Probably they need something like 5 minutes, but it still gives them enough time to really take this seriously. Because if you don't give them much time, they won't take it very seriously. And there's a greater chance they won't apply when they're back at work. So now we can go to the first part, which is priming. So this has been something very interesting for me since I moved back to the UK, because when I was in China, I had to spend a huge chunk of the beginning of the day on priming and getting people to feel comfortable. And I, and think of this from a Chinese participant's perspective. They walk into a classroom, they associate that with their childhood. And their childhood was a classroom with a very strict teacher, very long hours. There are right answers and there are wrong answers. And what is most horrific is they actually rank people in the class. So you will see your name on a list, and hopefully you do not appear on position number 50, because then you are the worst in class. And that just brings so much shame. So a classroom is a really traumatic experience for them. Add into that it's a very hierarchical culture. And so anyone senior to them in that room adds pressure. And also it's a culture where they're very sensitive to face. So any chance of making a mistake, embarrassing themselves, even more pressure. So I had to put a lot of effort into really helping people relax and feel safe. In this country, I find it a lot easier, to be honest. I don't spend as much time on it. People it's still going to be people who feel uncomfortable, but it's just a lot easier. So, long story short, we want to help people feel safe and interested at the beginning of the workshop. And there are 3 questions that we want to help them find answers for. We don't want to give them answers. We want to help them find answers by themselves to make it a bit more engaging. And question is, who? Like, who the fuck are you? Who are you? Like, are you someone that's going to respect them? Are you someone that they can actually trust? Are you someone who really knows what they're talking about? And what about the people around them? Can they trust each other? Is this a safe environment? And then why? Why am I here? My boss told me to be here, but why should I care about being here? What's the benefit for me? And then how? So a little story about how. I remember I was in Singapore and I was running a workshop and I was co-facilitating. And we had participants from all over the Asia Pacific region. And we had 2 participants from India. And at the beginning of the day, they said, we have to leave at about 4 o'clock because we've got a flight to catch at 7 p.m. And we don't want to be late for that. In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, if that's what they need to do, that's going to help them feel safe. That's going to relax them. They're going to be able to concentrate more. But before I could say anything, my co-facilitator said, oh, I don't know about that. Like, the last hour is really important. I don't think you should leave at 4 o'clock. Like, you'll get there on time. And I just thought, how fucking stupid. Because now they're going to be worried throughout the whole day. Like, am I going to be on time for my flight or not? So really focus on helping people feel safe if we want them to open up. And these are questions that they should answer themselves, through activities. So again, you can use this framework, these principles to really energize the activity. And simultaneous surveys is what I do at the beginning of the day to really warm them up. Now, sometimes if it's a virtual workshop, I'll just put them into small groups and just get them to discuss one or two things and at least feel comfortable with a few other people. But that's what we want to do at the beginning of the day. We want to help them find answers to this. So I'm going to wrap up in a few moments, but the priming part, I'm going to allow 10 minutes for that because people turn up late. Like even today, scheduled to start at 1, and most people sign on about 3 minutes past 1, some 6 minutes past 1. That's just the reality. So we want to have that time at the beginning for people to gradually make their way in, but also to help them feel safe and help them feel interested and feel really engaged. Now, I'm sure your maths is better than mine, but right now we have 55 minutes out of 60 minutes of this workshop, which means that the guiding section, we only have 5 minutes. And in my opinion, that's fine because a lot of the learning is going to happen in the reflection phase. And the more they are doing things throughout the workshop, the more they will learn. And the guiding part is where you're talking the most. And so, and Liz, yeah, it might depend on the amount of input that is needed for the topic, though. Yes, but we also don't want to overwhelm them too much. And also, I would say the nuance in the topic comes out through the reflection part. So the guiding, and yes, the guiding is where we put the content in. The guiding should be just enough to get them ready to start practicing. And then the nuance will come out in that discussion. That's where we can go into the detail. Because if we give too much at this point, it's going to overwhelm them. And my principle is in a workshop, so webinars are different because it's mostly a presentation, but in a workshop, I don't want to do more than 10 minutes of content at a time and move them onto something. And then any nuance comes out through the discussion. And so a simple framework, if you are doing the guiding part, why, what, how. So we're introducing the SBI model for feedback. Why are we doing this? You know, you have difficult behaviors at work. You need to catch that before it gets out of control. So what should you do? Here's a framework. It's called SBI. How do we use this example exactly? Well, here's an example of how it works. It should be very simple, very short, very sweet. And then just like that, we have a 60-minute workshop designed. So I'm going to finish there, leave a bit of time for Q&A. We've just been through 5 elements, framework that I used to design my workshops and my book was based upon. I've worked with clients on using this approach to design workshops too. If you're interested in anything else of what I do, you can check out thestoryhabit.com or email me here and you can see what kind of workshops I have available. But I will now open up to any questions you have. So yeah, any questions, please ask away.
Yes, if you have any questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can also, we do have a dedicated Q&A box. So if you want to put them in either the Q&A box or the chat for Jamie, and then he'll be able to answer those.
Yeah. Q&A box. Yep, I have the, okay. Would I recommend using lunch breaks when doing a one-day workshop in person as a working lunch, or let the learners just use the time as a chance to spend it as they wish and maybe even vent? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by working lunch, but my preference is always to give them time to relax and use that time as they want. I find I get a lot of feedback that people just feel so relaxed, and it really helps them open up in my workshops. And I think that's because I approach it with that attitude. Like, I know you're busy. I don't want to add more stress. I want you to enjoy this. And I don't want this to feel like something you have to push through. So I absolutely would go with let the learners just use the time as they wish. That would be my preference. Yeah. Thank you very much. Liz, do I ban laptops? At the beginning of the day, I do say I have 2 requests. If you do have work to do, please just go out of the room. You can go out of the room anytime. I completely understand. I just prefer that you don't do it in the room because it distracts other people. And the second request is phones. Even if you have a simple phone call, please just take it out of the room. If you need to leave the room at any time, I completely understand. But I would just prefer that we use this room for this workshop. So that's how I approach that. And yes, Sarah, I think having access to phones makes people feel safe. Yes. Yeah, we're all addicted to our phones if you think about it. And to take that away from someone really does not make them feel comfortable. Dina, how would you take consideration of neurodiverse considerations? To be honest, I am still learning about that. One thing I've started doing, I used to, as a efficient way of getting through content, I would sometimes put the slide on the screen and say, okay, I'll just give you a moment to read this rather than me talking at you. But I later realized that there are some people who are dyslexic and that actually doesn't work for them. So that's one thing I'm trying to do. For other things, it's something I'm still learning about. I do, with people who need a bit more quiet time, I do try to allow periods of quiet time before discussions. The idea of one to many. If you're going to have a discussion, first give you a moment to reflect on your own, then share with pairs or a small group, and then let's share as a class. But yeah, I'll be honest, that is something I'm still trying to learn about. And I think that's a great question, Tina. Any advice on workshops with groups with a range of mobility issues that limits their movement around the room? Well, yeah, I think you wouldn't want to pressure them to move around the room much at all. Make it as simple as possible for them to do activities. And still, I mean, you can still do things that don't require a lot of mobility. Simple things with maybe pictures on the table, fidget toys or whatever, can still add a little bit of energy. These are all things you can buy on Amazon. And Liz, yes, yeah, the quiet thing, not necessarily neurodiverse. There are highly sensitive people who do need a bit of less stimulus, which goes into personality neurodiversity. But yeah. So thank you for the questions. Any other questions? All right.
I think that's it.
Oh,
I've
Fiona.
got one more from Fiona.
I'm still working in an environment where colleagues insist on a 4 to 6 hour information dump. The audience is expected to listen. You mentioned moving to, do you have any advice on how to change the culture of colleagues who have a more traditional approach? I worked with an insurance company a while ago, and I saw the first slide of their onboarding training, and the title was The Theory of Insurance. And maybe it's easier for me as an outsider who also, I've been brought in, so there's some credibility. So it's easy for me to kind of point out things. But I got them to do a little, imagine you are a graduate who has, you've just started your first job. You didn't own a suit until 3 weeks ago. and all of your cool friends joined the high-tech companies, and you're here at this boring insurance company, and you've just walked into a meeting room that was designed for 6 people, and it's full of 30 people, and you sit down, and the first thing you see is a slide that says the theory of insurance. I said that to them, and I said, how would you feel? And that did give them some food for thought. So yeah, I don't have a simple answer to your question, but I think they really need to understand how the audience feels and see the impact that's having on the audience before they can start to realize, oh, maybe we should change our approach. And yeah, Liz, I guess they haven't experienced how much better it could be. Yeah, I suppose they haven't. And also, it's probably just what they're used to as well. Everyone else does it this way, so I suppose we should. Yeah, I yeah. I sometimes got, in China, it's a very traditional culture. They have very specific expectations on learning, and learning should be an expert lecturing at them. And, I think that's bullshit. It doesn't really matter about the culture. The science of learning is clear, but I had to appease that to some extent. Otherwise, I couldn't get through to them. So, yeah, it's a tricky game. Yeah, if they can experience what the audience does, what the audience experiences, that might help them see the difference. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, thanks everybody for your questions. We had some great comments and questions. Jamie, massive thank you again for a brilliant session. We appreciate your time and your insight. If you remember, you'll have access to this recording and any shared resources via the members dashboard shortly after the session. And if you enjoyed today's session and you're not a member, you can join us for just £29 a year at the Learning network.org, supporting your development and helping us offer more events like these. Thanks again to Jamie and to all of you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again soon at another Learning Network event.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.